They laughed when a 20-year-old girl refused to plow one strip of her family's farm. Months later, that decision saved an entire valley. Most people believe disasters arrive without warning. They don't. Sometimes, the warning has been sitting quietly inside an old notebook for 60 years. The real tragedy is that no one bothers to read it. When the river finally overflowed that spring, hundreds of acres disappeared beneath muddy water. Fences collapsed. Crops vanished overnight. Families watched generations of hard work drown beneath a current they could never stop. But one farm remained standing. Not because it was larger, not because it was richer, and certainly not because it was lucky. It survived because a 20-year-old girl trusted the faded handwriting of a man almost everyone else had forgotten. Her name was Ruby Callaway. Long before anyone called her intelligent, they called her naive. Long before they respected her, they laughed whenever she spoke. And before the flood changed everything, they thought she was destroying the family farm. Ruby had grown up believing that every piece of land carried a memory. Her grandfather used to say that healthy soil could speak. You just have to learn how to listen. As a child, she thought it sounded like another one of his old farming stories. Years later, she would realize he had been teaching her something far more valuable than farming. He had been teaching her patience. The Callaway farm sat outside, a quiet farming community where traditions were treated almost like laws. Most families planted exactly the way their parents had planted. Questions were unnecessary. New ideas were dangerous, and experience always defeated youth. After her grandfather passed away, the old equipment she'd remained untouched for years. Nobody had any reason to enter it. It was simply another weathered building slowly disappearing beneath dust and forgotten memories. Until one rainy afternoon, Ruby had been searching for replacement parts for an old tractor when she noticed a small wooden chest hidden beneath cracked canvas tarps. The hinges barely moved. Dust covered every corner. Inside, there were dozens of worn journals, not financial records, not family letters, field journals. Every notebook contained careful observations written in neat handwriting. Rainfall measurements, soil conditions, creek levels, wind direction, native grasses, flood patterns, season after season, year after year. Some entries stretched back more than half a century. Ruby spent hours reading page after page. Then hours became days. Days became weeks. She realized something remarkable. Her grandfather hadn't simply farmed this land. He had studied it. Like a scientist, like someone who believed nature always left clues for those willing to pay attention. One particular notebook caught her attention. Across the top of one yellowed page, her grandfather had written only 6 words. "Never fight the river, guide it." Ruby frowned. Below those words sat a rough hand-drawn map of the western field. Beside one narrow strip of land, he had written another note. "Leave this ground untouched. One day it will protect everything behind it." She read the sentence again. And again. It sounded impossible. Why would anyone intentionally leave productive farmland unused, especially when every acre mattered? Still, something about those pages refused to leave her mind. The following morning, she walked the property before sunrise. Cold mist floated above the creek while birds echoed through the trees. She followed the old map exactly. Every landmark matched. The bend in the creek, the large oak tree, the gentle slope leading toward the lower pasture. Even after 60 years, the land still remembered. Ruby stood quietly staring across the narrow strip her grandfather had marked. Nothing about it looked special. Most people would have driven a tractor straight through it without giving it another thought. Instead, she knelt down. She scooped a handful of soil into her palm. Dark, soft, alive, different from the surrounding ground. That afternoon, she made a decision that would change her life. She marked nearly 60 feet beside the creek and announced she would never plow it again. Her father looked at her as though she had lost her mind. 60 feet? She nodded. It needs to stay exactly as it is. But that's good farmland. I know. Then why would we waste it? Ruby hesitated before placing one of the journals on the kitchen table. Granddad believed this land wasn't meant for crops. Silence filled the room. Her father slowly opened the notebook. He read several pages, then quietly closed it again. I trusted my father. He looked at Ruby. And I trust you. It wasn't complete confidence. It wasn't certainty. It was something far more valuable. Faith. Outside the kitchen window, neighbors were already preparing their fields for spring. Within days, everyone would notice the untouched strip running beside the creek. And before long, the entire county would begin talking. The gossip began faster than Ruby expected. In a town where everyone knew everyone else, news traveled quicker than the wind. By the end of the week, nearly every farmer along County Road 7 had heard the same story. Old Tom Callaway's granddaughter has lost her mind. She's throwing away perfectly good farmland. College filled her head with nonsense. Some laughed while drinking coffee at Miller's General Store. Others simply shook their heads. Kids these days think books know more than experience, one farmer muttered. The room filled with quiet agreement. Nobody bothered asking Ruby why she had made the decision. They had already decided she was wrong. Every morning before sunrise, Ruby walked the untouched strip beside the creek. Tiny green shoots had already begun pushing through the soil. Native grasses, wild sedge, young switchgrass, plants that had survived there long before tractors arrived. Most farmers considered them weeds. Ruby saw something different. She saw protection. She carried her grandfather's notebook everywhere now. Each evening she compared what she observed with his handwritten notes. Water moved differently near the grass. The soil stayed cooler. Small birds nested among the tall stems. Even insects seemed more abundant there. It was as if the land itself was slowly proving his words correct. Her father watched quietly from the porch one afternoon. You've been studying that notebook every day. Ruby smiled. I'm still learning. He nodded. Your grandfather used to do exactly the same thing. She looked toward the creek. I wish I had asked him more questions. Her father smiled sadly. We always think we'll have more time. Those words stayed with Ruby long after the conversation ended. The following Saturday, several neighboring farmers stopped their trucks along the roadside. Not to help, to watch. Burl Simmons leaned against his pickup, arms crossed. So, he called loudly, when are you planning to plant this empty strip? Ruby wiped the dirt from her gloves. I'm not. The men exchanged amused looks. You really believe an old notebook over modern farming? I believe someone who spent 50 years studying this land. Another man laughed. Well, I believe corn pays better than grass. The group burst into laughter. Ruby didn't answer. She simply returned to work. Sometimes silence is stronger than arguments. That evening she found another journal. This one was different. Instead of weather notes, it contained sketches. Hand-drawn maps of every flood her grandfather had witnessed. Dates, water levels, flow directions, creek overflow points. One page caught her attention immediately. Across the top he had written, The river never steals. It only returns to where it once belonged. Ruby stared at the drawing for several minutes. Then she noticed something else. Every major flood followed almost the exact same path, right through the fields neighboring the creek, including theirs. But every sketch showed one important difference. Where thick native grass remained, the water slowed. Where fields had been plowed to the creek's edge, the banks collapsed. Suddenly everything made sense. The grass wasn't wasting land. It was protecting it. That night, Ruby spread every journal across the dining room table. Page after page began connecting like pieces of an enormous puzzle. Her grandfather hadn't guessed. He had observed, measured, recorded, verified, again and again. For decades, she realized something few people ever understood. Experience wasn't simply growing older. Experience meant paying attention. Spring rains arrived earlier than expected. Nothing serious, just several steady storms. The creek rose slightly each day. Most farmers ignored it. Seasonal rain was normal. Ruby wasn't so sure. Each evening she measured the water level exactly as her grandfather had done. She wrote every number into a brand new notebook, creating her own record, continuing the work he had started 60 years earlier. One afternoon, her father noticed fresh wooden stakes running beside the untouched strip. "What are those for?" "I want to measure erosion." "You think the creek's going to rise?" "I don't know." She looked toward the cloudy sky. But Granddad always said uncertainty is the best time to prepare. Her father smiled proudly. "You sound more like him every day." Meanwhile, the jokes around town became even louder. Someone started calling the untouched strip Ruby's Garden. Others referred to it as the most expensive mistake in the county. Even local teenagers slowed their trucks just to point and laugh. Ruby heard every word. She simply kept working, because proving people wrong was never her goal. Protecting the farm was. Late one evening, while closing the old equipment shed, Ruby discovered one final notebook hidden behind a loose wooden board. It was smaller than the others. Its leather cover had almost fallen apart. Inside, only a handful of pages remained. Most had been damaged by time, but one sentence was still perfectly readable. She whispered the words aloud. "When the spring rain lasts longer than 7 days, don't watch the sky, watch the river." Ruby slowly looked toward the dark horizon. Rain clouds were already gathering again, for reasons she couldn't explain. A chill ran through her entire body. She closed the notebook carefully. Something told her the real test hadn't even begun. The rain began on a Monday morning. At first, no one paid much attention. Spring storms were common across the valley. Farmers continued planting. Tractors rolled across freshly turned soil while children waited for school. Buses beneath gray skies. Ruby stood on the porch holding her grandfather's notebook. She wasn't watching the clouds. She was watching the creek. Its current looked different, not higher, faster. The water carried broken branches, leaves, and dark pieces of soil for miles upstream. She opened the notebook to the page she had nearly memorized. "The river always speaks before it shouts." Her grandfather's words echoed inside her mind. For the first time, fear quietly settled into her chest. The rain continued through Tuesday, then Wednesday. By Thursday morning, the creek had already climbed over its lowest banks. Neighbors weren't worried. "This happens every spring," Burl Simmons said while fueling his tractor. "It'll be gone by the weekend." Several farmers nodded confidently. Most of them had seen dozens of rainy seasons. Experience had made them comfortable. Maybe too comfortable. Ruby wasn't convinced. Every evening she measured the water, level against the old oak tree, exactly as her grandfather had once done. The numbers matched his journal almost perfectly. She showed the notebook to her father. "If this pattern continues..." She paused. "The creek won't stop at the lower pasture." Her father looked toward the river. "You really think it'll flood?" "I think Granddad already knew." Friday morning brought another storm. This one was different. The wind howled across the fields. Rain hammered rooftops so hard that conversations became impossible. The creek no longer looked peaceful. It looked alive, angry. Brown water crashed against its banks, carrying entire tree limbs downstream. Ruby walked toward the protected grass strip. The tall native grass bent under the force of the wind but refused to collapse. Its roots held the soil together, exactly as her grandfather had predicted decades earlier. She knelt beside the creek. The water slowed as it entered the grass. Mud settled. The current weakened. The notebook had been right. Every single word. Across the road, things looked very different. Freshly plowed fields had become rivers of mud. Water rushed freely over bare soil, cutting deep channels across expensive farmland. Ruby watched helplessly as entire sections of newly planted crops disappeared downstream. She whispered softly, "It's happening." By Saturday afternoon, Emergency weather alerts appeared on every local television station. Meteorologists warned residents to stay away from rivers and low-lying roads. Schools announced early closures. The county emergency office opened temporary shelters. Still, many farmers believed the worst would pass. After all, it always had before. That evening, Ruby walked into the old equipment shed one more time. She wasn't looking for answers anymore. She was looking for courage. Her grandfather's weathered journal sat quietly inside the wooden chest. She gently placed her hand on the cover of the oldest notebook. "I hope I understood you correctly," she whispered. Outside, thunder shook the valley. Sunday arrived with no sunrise. Dark storm clouds covered the entire sky. Rain had now fallen for 7 straight days, exactly as the notebook described. Ruby hurried to the creek before breakfast. The moment she reached the bank, her heart stopped. The water had reached the first wooden stake she had placed weeks earlier. Only inches remained before it overflowed into the fields. She didn't panic. Instead, she began moving equipment to higher ground. Her father watched silently. "You really think it's coming?" Ruby looked toward the roaring river. "No." She took a slow breath. "I think it's already here." Less than 3 hours later, the first section of the creek bank collapsed nearly half a mile upstream. The sound echoed like distant thunder. Water exploded across nearby fields with terrifying force. Within minutes, roads disappeared. Fences vanished beneath muddy water. Sirens filled the valley. Neighbors rushed to rescue livestock while tractors became trapped in rising floodwater. The peaceful farming community had turned into chaos. Ruby and her father stood beside the untouched grass strip. The water reached it. Then something incredible happened. Instead of crashing straight across the field, the thick native grass slowed the current. The roots held the soil together. Mud settled. The force of the flood weakened. The water spread gently instead of violently tearing the land apart. Exactly, as one old notebook had predicted 60 years earlier. Ruby could barely breathe. Her grandfather hadn't left behind memories. He had left behind a way to save the future. She stared across the valley as floodwaters continued, racing toward neighboring farms. And for the first time, she realized this disaster wasn't just going to change her family's life. It was about to change the entire county forever. Monday morning arrived in complete silence. The storm had finally moved east. But the valley no longer looked the way it had just 24 hours earlier. Fields that had once stretched for miles beneath golden sunlight had become endless pools of muddy water. Broken fences floated through the current. Tractors sat half submerged. Entire sections of crops had simply disappeared. For many families, one night had erased an entire year of work. Ruby stood on the small hill overlooking her family's farm. She expected devastation. Instead, she found something almost impossible to believe. The western field was still standing. The 60-foot strip of untouched, native grass had done exactly what her grandfather predicted decades earlier. The rushing water had slowed as it reached the buffer. The roots had locked the soil in place. Instead of cutting through the field, the flood had gently spread across the grass before flowing back toward the creek. Ruby slowly walked to the edge of the strip. The damage stopped almost exactly where the grass began. She knelt down and ran her fingers across the damp earth. The soil was still there. The crops behind it were bruised, but alive. Tears quietly filled her eyes. She wasn't crying because they had won. She was crying because her grandfather had been right. All those years, his voice had been waiting inside those forgotten notebooks. Her father joined her a few minutes later. Neither of them spoke. Words felt unnecessary. Finally, he looked across the protected field and whispered. He knew. Ruby nodded. He understood this land better than anyone. Her father smiled sadly. I spent years thinking those journals were nothing more than old memories. He looked at his daughter. They were instructions. News of the flood spread quickly across the county. Emergency crews worked around the clock. Local radio stations reported millions of dollars in agricultural losses. Insurance adjusters arrived before sunrise. Government officials began surveying damaged farmland. Almost every farm near the river suffered severe erosion, except one, the Callaway farm. By Tuesday afternoon, pickup trucks began appearing outside Ruby's property. Not reporters, not tourists, farmers, one by one. They parked quietly beside the road. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody made jokes about wasted farmland. They simply stood staring at the untouched strip beside the creek. The same strip they had mocked only weeks earlier. The first person to walk toward Ruby was Burl Simmons, the loudest critic in the county. He removed his old baseball cap before speaking. "I owe you an apology." Ruby smiled gently. "You don't owe me anything." He shook his head. "I laughed at you." He looked toward the creek. "I lost nearly 30 acres. His voice cracked. "I've farmed this land for 25 years, and I've never seen anything like this." Ruby remained silent. Sometimes people don't need advice. They simply need someone willing to listen. After several moments, Burl quietly asked, "Will you show me how you did it?" Ruby looked toward her grandfather's journals resting inside the farmhouse. A soft smile crossed her face. "It wasn't my idea." Over the following days, more farmers arrived. Young farmers, older farmers, families who had once ignored her, even people from neighboring counties. Every conversation began almost the same way. "We heard your farm survived. What did you plant? How wide should the grass be? Can we see the journals?" Ruby answered every question patiently. She never reminded anyone how they had mocked her. She never said, "I told you so," because wisdom doesn't need revenge. It only needs to be shared. Later that week, the County Agricultural Extension Office contacted Ruby. They wanted to inspect the property. 3 specialists arrived carrying cameras, measuring equipment, and notebooks. For hours they walked beside the creek studying every foot of the untouched buffer. They measured soil depth. They examined root systems. They compared erosion levels with neighboring farms. By sunset, their conclusion was impossible to ignore. The native vegetation had reduced erosion dramatically. One of the specialists looked at Ruby in complete amazement. "Where did you learn this?" She didn't hesitate. "My grandfather." The man smiled. He was decades ahead of his time. Ruby looked toward the old equipment shed standing quietly in the distance. "No," she whispered. He was simply paying attention. That evening, the valley looked different. Not because the flood had ended, but because people had finally started listening. And Ruby knew her grandfather's greatest harvest had never been corn. It had been knowledge. Knowledge that had waited 60 years. For someone brave enough to believe it. Over the next 2 weeks, the visitors never stopped coming. Not because they wanted to apologize, because they wanted to understand. Every farmer who stepped onto the Callaway farm asked the same question. What did you do differently? Ruby never claimed she had discovered anything new. Instead, she carried her grandfather's weathered journals to the porch and patiently explained every observation he had written decades earlier. She showed them how native grasses slowed rushing water, how deep roots protected the soil, how leaving one narrow strip untouched could save an entire field. The same people who had once laughed now listened carefully, writing notes and asking questions. No one interrupted. No one smiled. Experience had finally taught them humility. A few days later, the county agricultural office invited Ruby to speak at a local conservation meeting. She had never spoken in front of a crowd before. Standing in front of dozens of experienced farmers made her nervous. She took a deep breath and held up one of her grandfather's journals. "I didn't come here to tell you that I was right," she began quietly. "I came to tell you that someone else was, and I was simply willing to listen." The room became completely silent. For the next hour, Ruby explained everything she had learned. She answered every question honestly. She admitted what she didn't know. and she shared everything her grandfather had left behind. When the meeting ended, several farmers stayed behind to thank her personally. One elderly farmer shook her hand and smiled. "Your grandfather would be proud of you." Ruby lowered her eyes. "I hope so." That evening she returned home just before sunset. Her father was sitting on the old porch, watching the fields glowing beneath the golden light. He smiled as she sat beside him. "I heard the meeting went well." She nodded. They listened. Her father looked across the protected strip beside the creek. "You know, I used to think your grandfather spent too much time writing instead of talking." He paused before continuing. "But today I realized something. He wasn't writing for himself. He was writing for someone he believed would one day need those pages." Ruby looked toward the old equipment shed where she had first found the journals. For a moment she imagined her grandfather standing there with his familiar smile, not saying a word, just watching. The following spring, farms across the county began planting native grass buffers along their creeks. The local conservation office launched workshops inspired by Ruby's presentation. Within 2 years, hundreds of acres were better protected from erosion. One forgotten notebook had quietly changed an entire community. Years later, whenever someone asked Ruby how she managed to save the farm, she always gave the same answer. "I didn't save it alone. My grandfather planted the idea. I simply trusted it." Sometimes the greatest legacy isn't money, or land, or even a family name. Sometimes it's a lesson written on fading paper, waiting for someone brave enough to believe it.